Hi, I'm Michael, and this is my master proposal and analysis. For my first unmastered track, I've decided to use a song called Struggle City by Mikey Massacre. And if I just play a little bit. And my reference track one is a song called All My Friends Are Dead by Turbo and Grow. I feel the genres both match quite evenly.
All my friends are dead. Got kicked in the head. All my friends are dead. All my friends are dead.
When listening, I noticed the styles, guitar tones, and even the approaches to mixing are quite similar. This would be the aggressive and wide guitars, quite prominent in the middle and upper frequencies. The drums actually being pushed up in the mix. It's very like amongst the rest of the band. The bass is sitting back. It's not very low end heavy. Maybe it's because of its kind of style and genre, but it also has a lot of kind of tone and character, so it kind of cuts through the mix a little bit, like on the upper end. The vocals, despite being raw and very easy like to distinguish and hear, it sits quite far back in the band, but it's been given its like place and space and frequency, so it's, although it's not very loud and upfront, it's quite understandable. When listening to reference track one attributes and running it through the EQ to see what was what, I noticed the bass and the kick drum are sitting around 60 to 70 hertz. Not very low and prominent like a lot of modern songs, but a bit more kind of higher end characteristics. The cymbals and hi-hats cut through, but again not too high, so not too far the other way in the upper end, with between 6 and 16,000 hertz. Nothing's really going on before 30 hertz and after 16, so it's kind of collectively quite tight in the middle. The snare's been given its own space between 200 and 260 hertz, but it actually sits back in the mix. But because it's been given its own space, it's quite prominent. The guitars are being given plenty of body, so a lot of high and low end. Not too muddy in the middle, but you can kind of hear it crunches in the lower frequencies, but also kind of very distinguishable with the high end frequencies. The upper mids of the track sound thick. Sounds very crunchy and quite full and quite wide actually. Like the middle kind of range of the guitars, they're spread quite wide. And the vocals, like I said before, sit back in the mix, back within the instrumental, but still remains quite clear because of like the frequency space. This is how I plan to achieve a similar sound using Logic. So starting with an equalizer, I'll take away the muddy and unwanted sounds and cut up to 30 hertz. I'll also boost around the 60 and 70 hertz mark to slightly imitate the kind of bass from the reference track. Like that's what I'll kind of, instead of it being between like 40 and 50, I'll kind of push the bass along to the kind of 60 and 70 and make that my prominent area to hopefully imitate the reference. I'll then be using a vintage graphic EQ. Using that, I'll probably focus on the 10,000 and 20,000 hertz, like pushing them to suit, in the hope to maybe bring out the cymbals and the hi-hats, bring out the vocals more because I know they're going to be set back in the mix, and then the higher end tones of the guitar, because the guitars had a lot of body, but they also had quite a lot of upper end. But really, it'll probably, after comparing them, this will probably only be quite slight with the track. Using the drive feature, it's good for like saturation, and it adds more like thickness to it, so that'll help me achieve a kind of a thicker middle crunch, which I was talking about previous when I was breaking down the reference track. I'll also be using a multi-band compressor. I'll be using this to take away any of the unwanted high frequencies, around about 15,000 hertz. I'll be using the threshold to compress the harsh sounds whilst using like a high ratio, like a bit like a limiter. I could also tweak the elements in bands 1, 2, and 3, but I'm not wanting to do this too much in this one, at risk of like losing dynamics of the track. It also helps control brightness, so brightness in the snare and sibilance in the vocals. It'll help kind of eradicate that. I'll use this also to keep an eye on levels and peaking at the output. I'm going to be using an exciter as well, around about the 7 kilohertz region. Onwards, maybe with between 8 and 9 plus on the harmonics. Now, this is where I'm going to make my low set back vocals. This is going to help kind of bring it out a little bit, because unlike an EQ amplifying what's already there, this will raise the harmonics and fundamental tones within like the vocals, and it also helps a little bit of the cymbals as well. This, like I says, this will help me achieve a bit more of a clearer vocals, despite them being quite set back in level and volume. Again, with trying to make my vocals prominent, I'm going to be, on top of the exciter, I'm going to be using a spreader. It'll kind of help lift the vocals from the lower middle to like an upper wide position, as long as I highlight the kind of higher frequencies between 2000 and 20,000 hertz. So hopefully it wouldn't affect and widen too much of the rest of the track, and hopefully just bring out solely the vocals, or as much as I can help. But I'll just I'll keep it quite low, not too drastic, between 8 and 10% on the lower and upper sides. Back to trying to help within thickness, I'm going to be using the bit crusher, but it also functions a bit like a clipper. As long as I keep the drive somewhere between 1.5 and 3, I keep the resolution at 24 and the downsampling at 1. And if I keep the clip level at minus 0.2, that really just kind of keeps it in a safe space and stops it from peaking. Now, the adaptive limiter, that's a little bit just more standard. Help me know if I just need to adjust any volume. I'll also have the true peak on and set the out ceiling to between 0.2 and 0.5, a little bit like my bit crusher, and that's going to, again, just help to avoid clipping. Another standard plugin I'm going to use is the multimeter. Helps me kind of keep the level and sound in control. If I set the LUFS and RMS at the competitive levels of -9 and -8, which would be normalized at -14, as long as I have the level set to true peak and an RMS for streaming purposes, that seems to be the kind of standard for that. I can then play the gain of the adaptive limiter against these settings to make sure they're hitting these competitive levels on the LUFS, to make sure it's all kind of coming through as a professional kind of level and sound. For my song 2, I've decided to go for a track called Dead Enemies by Dark Ride. This time the genre sits around the melodic metal and progressive metal region.
Shadows of my past, grey streams of the walls. Our sands, the last decade has changed the world for all. Lights are growing dim, the curtains set to fall. But still the stage is crowded, it won't begin. I've seen 1,000 times these raging actors smiles.
And for my song 2 reference track, I've chosen a song called Nightmare by Avenged Sevenfold. Again, these genres match fairly evenly. That's kind of why I chose them together. When I was comparing the similarities this time, I noticed that, again, with vocal tone, guitar tones and approaches to mixing being quite similar. This time it's the deep and dark and thick sounding rhythm guitars, a lot more kind of bottom and middle end kind of heavy. The modern low end presence of the kick drum, and that's pushed right up in the mix, so it's a very low thudding, but still with a lot of body kind of kick drum, really kind of up there. Very punchy and snappy snares. The bass sitting very close to the kick, kind of making more depth. It's a very kind of low-end heavy combination. But this time the vocals are kind of upfront and modern, like really pushed through the mix and very clear. So when looking at track two's attributes, I noticed that there's a lot going on from 30 to 100 hertz this time. That'd be the kick and the bass, showing a lot more kind of modern depth, but still with upper end personality. The kick drum's cutting through at a hard, quite around 65 hertz, and the cymbal and hi hats cut not too high again, but remain tight with the band, a bit like the last song, between 6,000 and 16,000. Slight tails under 30,000, and still has some upper presence up to like 16,500. So it's a little bit more modern. It's got a little bit more dynamics either side in comparison to my last two tracks. The snare's main body punches through at around 200 hertz, fairly prominent. The rhythm guitars have been given plenty of body, again, high and low end. The mids and upper mids of the track sound thick, full and wide, but especially this time with the rhythm guitars. The vocals, like I said before, are very clear, upfront and modern. And this is how I plan to achieve a similar sound. And a bit of a standard fashion again with the equalizer, taking away the 30 hertz, getting rid of the muddy, unwanted sounds. This time I'm going to boost around the 65 hertz to bring out that kick drum I mentioned, like matching the reference track too, just give it a little bit more prominence. I'll also be pushing up the snare about 200 hertz, help kind of match the snare punch to the reference track as well. So quite similar again, using the vintage graphic EQ, focusing on the 10,000 and 20,000, pushing them to suit, bringing out the vocals and the lead guitar. But this time I'll also touch up between 31 and 63 hertz to encourage that modern sound and feel to the bottom end. Using the drive again for the saturation and the thickness in that middle to really bring out that kind of crunch in the middle and upper middle. Again, with a multi-band compressor, I'll focus on that 15 kilohertz to get rid of that unwanted upper end, the harsh sounds. But this time, I'll possibly push up and tweak band 1 and 2, just to help the unmastered track not sound too thin and give it a bit more body, a bit like the reference track. So this time with the exciter, I'll be trying to find exactly the right frequency area and help push them for vocals forward and up front. Being a little bit kind of more drastic this time if I can, because we're very kind of modern and had a lot of presence. And following that with the spreader, helping to lift the vocals again, I'm going to this time open up the kind of the frequency coverage to try and kind of spread the upper middle area of the guitars, because them rhythm guitars were kind of very wide on the reference track. So I'm going to try and kind of capture them as well as the vocals to kind of spread across the mix. Again, this time using the Big Crusher like a clipper again. This time I think I'll use a little bit more drive, pushing it maybe up to the 3 kind of level. Obviously avoiding peaking, keeping the headroom at 0.2, but this will the unmastered track sounded a little bit thin, so this should hopefully help a little bit with the thickness and give it a little bit more body and power. But this time I'm going to use a plugin called Fat FX, and I'm going to use the distortion, bass enhancer and the master. I'm going to have them engaged. I'm going to add some soft saturation for a bit perceived loudness, not actually altering the levels too much, but giving just that feeling of a little bit more volume and level. I'm going to be using a small amount of the bass enhancer because I really want that warmth and roundness and the depth of that modern lower frequencies. Really kind of helps with that modern edge of the reference track. I'm going to have it set at around 50 hertz, and I'm only going to use a bit of a small amount, just enough to kind of really hear that kind of thud break through the mix and the bottom end. Again, with the standard adaptive limiter, just setting the out ceiling to help with the clipping and setting the gain so I really get them levels. And the same with the multimeter. This is going to be quite standard through all my mixes, and I'll be playing the adaptive limiter gain against this again to make sure I'm hitting the competitive levels. And for my song 3, I've chosen to use a track called A Mi Lado by Haziel. And the genre is a little bit varied, but I'd say it sits around the alternative and indie section. And the reference track I've chosen is a song called Texas Sun by Cranbing and Leon Bridges. Again, the genres are quite similar and the feeling of the track's similar as well.
Say you like the wind blowing through your hair. Well, come on, roll with me till the sun goes down.
This time, when I was comparing the similarities, I noticed low, round and smooth bass frequencies. Not too much upper presence this time. It just remained quite kind of low and deep. The drums are set back quite a bit, but the snare comes through quite nicely, kind of punches through a little bit. The vocals are relatively clean and prominent, but they're not, in comparison to my other two tracks, they're not too set back or they're not too pushed forward either. They're kind of a happy medium somewhere in between. And the attributes for the reference track, I noticed the drums, the kick drums sitting around 40 to 60 hertz, not very high and prominent, but still a little bit deeper than my first track. So I feel it's a little bit more modern, a bit smoother. The bass's upper end and personality can be heard and seen around 80 to 100 hertz. Nothing's going on before 30, so it's cut off quite clean. The cymbals are quite set back in the mix, but they're cut through nice from between like 6,000 and 10,000. They just kind of splash and kind of resonate through the mix, which is quite nice. The snare's also been given its space, like every other track really, but this time it's around 210 hertz. It's been given its own kind of little room to cut through. The guitars don't have much bottom end this time. They're very more upper mid and high end kind of focused in their frequency ranges. And the upper frequencies of the track are quite wide and spread. So some of the percussion, some of the vocals and other elements. And this is how I plan to achieve a similar sound. Starting with the equalizer, just to take away that 30 hertz again. But this time I'll push around the 210 hertz mark to let the snare kind of push through a little bit, but only slightly. And with the vintage graphic EQ, again, this time the same as the other tracks, focusing on the 10K and the 20K faders. But this time, like my last set of tracks, I will be looking at the 31 hertz and 63 hertz fader, but this time a little bit of the 125 hertz fader. This is just to cover the upper end bass characteristics and the low end, because it's got quite a wide spread of frequency, the bass, for its character and its bottom end. So this time with the multi-band compressor, again getting rid of the 15 kilohertz section, just all the piercing noises. I think the dynamics could be a little bit tighter in my unmastered track to match the reference, so I'll be tweaking around about the bands 1, 2 and 3 until it suits, avoiding complete loss of dynamics, but just to try and bring in a bit of a tighter sound in general. And then onto the exciter from 7 kilohertz onwards. I don't really need too much to push on this track because the vocals come through quite clearly already. So this time to cover a little bit more range of the upper frequencies I mentioned earlier that were quite widespread, I'm going to be setting the parameters from about 1750 to 20,000 hertz this time. Again, very slight, with like between 8 or 10% either side. And this will help bring out the vocals and the percussion and some of the higher end frequencies of the guitars, which would match the reference track. And with the Bit Crusher this time, it really will just be acting like a clipper. I won't be adding much drive because I don't think the track really needs it. Both tracks are quite similar in dynamics and don't really have much kind of thickness and crunch in the middle end. I'll be using the fat effects this time, a little bit like the last set of tracks I had. although this time, again, remaining with soft saturation, just a little bit, and then the bass enhancer to give a bit more warmth and roundness. But this time I'll be setting the tune to around 90 hertz to try and lift up the upper end frequencies of the bass and separating it a little bit from the low end of the kick, just to get a little bit of separation there so it's a bit more distinguished. And again, with the standard adaptive limiter, setting the ceiling to 0.2 to maximum to 0.5, minus 0.5 for the clipping. And then again with the multimeter, I'll be playing my adaptive limiter off it like I have in every track, just so I can maintain the competitive levels. And that is the end of my master proposal and analysis.